Welcome to ADATH. Welcome to the third of a four-part series. I want to express first my appreciation, our appreciation to Brenda and Sam Goertz for sponsoring this series, and deep appreciation to Concordia University and the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies. We are honored at ADATH to partner with this wonderful organization, and most of all to welcome and present Professor Chava Nikolny. The first two sessions, which by the way are recorded and online at our website, adath.ca. Thank you to Howie Silberger for providing the recordings, and each of the sessions is recorded in audio and video and available on our website. If you're following the news, we need a new lecture like every 15 minutes. It keeps changing. It's quite wild. Today there are some very difficult times and also some very positive signs for Israel. Like much of Israeli modern history, challenges and opportunities mixed at the same time. But Chava has been providing an amazing oversight of what's going on in Israel and a real handle to being able to understand the politics, what to look for, what to follow as we come closer to the elections on April 9th. This is the third of four. I just want to mention that this is the last session before the election. However, we will have the fourth session in May 27th, which will be a recap to look at what has happened over this time. And I know that that also will be a very, very interesting session. And I don't think we're ready to announce the details of it yet, but we are working on some type of election day event to follow the returns, but we don't yet have the details of that. We're looking forward to that. In any event, it's a pleasure to have you all here this evening, and it is a great pleasure to introduce good friend and a fantastic scholar, Professor Chava Nikolny.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Bittman. I would like to echo and add to the thanks a very special and heartfelt thank you on behalf of the Azrieli Institute to you, Rabbi Bittman, for being so open and welcoming to partner with us to bring this series of lectures to the Kahal, to you. I would also like to thank Sami and Brenda Geburtz for sponsoring the series, as Rabbi Bittman you mentioned. And last but certainly not least, I would like to thank you for coming out.
It's okay.
And I would also like to thank Howie for trying to do his best. Howie, shall we just switch to the...
No, you're okay, you're okay.
Yeah? Is this okay?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, wonderful. So, a huge thank you from all of us involved in making this happen, to you for coming out now for a third time on these progressively colder and colder winter evenings in Montreal. Who would have thought that on March 25th we would still have to say that. The theme of today's lecture is political leadership. And the subtitle that I wanted to, and that I did decide to assign to this talk is Who Will Form the 35th Israeli Government? And we will get there. The actual predictions, or rather ranges of predictions. And prediction is a very dicey word to use when you are in electoral studies, when you're in party politics studies. I'd rather like to talk about expectations. The end goal of this presentation will be to offer a range of structured expectations about the kinds of governments that we are likely going to see being formed in Israel. And so what I would like to do in the next 30 to 35 minutes is to provide a context and the build-up to what's going to happen in those crucial weeks after April 9th. And depending on how correct we are and depending on how prepared and skilled Israeli politicians will be, by the time we meet again in May, on May 27th, there may be a new government formed. Now, on the opening slide, of course, you see my initial hint and the kinds of expectations that I'm inviting you to think along with me during the next half an hour to 40 minutes or so. Who will form Israel's 35th government? Of course, you see on the slide 3 faces, and one answer will be, and of course, government is more than just the actual leader of the government, but that's where it begins. Who will be the leader? Who will be the prime minister of Israel's 35th government? And right now, based on the information what we have available to us, the answer is either Benny Gantz, former chief of staff of the Israel Defense Forces, leader of one of the larger formations in the current electoral campaign, now called the Blue and White. And please remember that last time we met, this formation wasn't yet formed. It was just a few days after we had our last session that his political party, Resilient Israel, or Resilience to Israel, and Yair Lapid's Yesh Atid political parties actually decided to form an electoral alliance. And here I stand. I remember an important question by Jack, who actually put me on the spot asking me, will there be such an alliance? And I didn't say yay or nay, but I did say, if I were Yair Lapid, I wouldn't enter into such an alliance. Yet here we are, the alliance was formed. Now, I will come to this later on, but this is an important point to note, that these two political parties are now running together in alliance, and that means that they also entered into a rotation agreement. In other words, if they find themselves in a situation of giving the prime minister to the next government, according to the rotation agreement, for the first half of the term available to them, Benny Gantz will be prime minister, and then he will be handing it over to Yair Lapid for the second bit of the term available to them. A very different expectation, of course, is if Mr. Benjamin Netanyahu, the outgoing or current prime minister, continues in office. And we are going to look at the possibilities, the probabilities associated with that outcome. But when it comes to the question of who will form the 35th Israeli government, there are really two questions that we need to zero in on. A, which political party is going to give the next prime minister? And who are the political parties? Which are the political parties that are going to be building a coalition that will support the prime minister in office? And now here is the plan for today's lecture. Very, very briefly, I would like to mention a couple of key points by way of a recap from the last two lectures. Then, since the topic is political leadership, I'm going to offer a brief overview of the history of Israeli governments and Israeli prime ministers to put in context the importance and the significance of what's at stake in the 2019 campaign. Then, since one of the probably the most crucial point that's at stake in this election is a judgment by the Israeli voters on what I call the Netanyahu decade. It is now 10 years that Prime Minister Netanyahu has been leading successive Israeli governments, and whether he continues in office or not, at the current or some other coalition, is going to tell us a judgment that the Israeli electorate has passed on him, yay or nay. And then I'm going to offer an overview of the Israeli government formation process, so that as we keep being bombarded by news after April 9th, you would be well situated to actually follow along in terms of what those different news items mean as the political strategies unfold. And then I would like to invite you to look at my crystal ball with me, which is as good as my last crystal ball was, and I keep looking at Jack. But let's see. I jump too quickly. Two important points I would like to recap from the last two lectures. The first is the nature of the Israeli electoral system. Please remember that Israel doesn't choose members of the Knesset the way we choose our parliamentarians in Canada. Every Israeli voter is entitled to casting one vote, and that vote goes for a party. That goes for a party. There are no candidate-specific votes. And the way in which seats are allocated amongst political parties is based on the principle of proportionality, proportional representation. That means that any political party that secures more votes than what they need to pass what's called the threshold, which is currently set at 3.25%, any vote above that gives you some representation in the Knesset. If you get 10% of the votes, you get about 10% of the seats. But you need to cross the threshold. That threshold today means that any party that gets into a Knesset will get about 4 or 3 seats, but no less than that. That's how the math works out. When Israel had much lower thresholds, you could get, and we did get in the Knesset, 2 and single member political parties. But those days, through the mathematics of the new system, are now eliminated, if you will. The second important point, which was the main theme of the second lecture, was a very important transformation that was taking place, and that is still taking place, in the national religious community, constituency of the Israeli party system. And the second lecture was entirely dedicated to understanding the formation of this new political party called the New Right, which was formed as soon as Prime Minister Netanyahu asked the Knesset to dissolve itself and have new elections. The New Right political party wants to move away from the traditional settlement-oriented approach that the national religious communities seem to have developed into, and wants to reach out to get more support from the Hilonit, from the secular conservative constituencies. This movement, this political party, is led by outgoing Minister of Education Naftali Bennett and outgoing Minister of Justice Ayelet Shaked. So that new political party was, and the transformation of the national religious constituency was the focus of the second lecture. And today we'll talk about political leadership. Here they are. These are the individuals, the 12 individuals who served as prime ministers at the helm of Israel's government since 1949. Until 1977, when Menachem Begin scored his historic electoral victory and for the first time actually formed and gave to Israel a conservative right-of-center coalition government. Until that point, Israel was governed by a series of left-wing coalitions, which invariably always included, as we discussed in the last lecture, not only parties from the left, but also parties that represented the religious sectors. So that was an important point to remember, the ongoing regular contribution and coalitional relevance, if you will, of the Israeli religious parties. Of course, David Ben-Gurion was the founding prime minister of the country, and as you will see in the next slide, he still holds the record for having served the longest, the highest number of cumulative days in office in Israel. Now, since 1977, there have been more right-wing governments than not. There have been more right-wing conservative prime ministers leading the country. And I say that even though 2 of them, Ariel Sharon and Ehud Olmert, spent part of their time, but certainly at the helm of Israeli political leadership, as leaders of a party that is no more, called Kadima. Ariel Sharon, of course, split away from his political party Likud, because he suffered a very difficult illness, he wasn't able to actually bring his party in the 17th Knesset to government. That task fell to Ehud Olmert. But remember, Ehud Olmert also was a former member of Likud. So we really do see that since Menachem Begin, we had Yitzhak Shamir, we had Sharon, we had Olmert, and now for a series of terms also Benjamin Netanyahu at the helm of Israeli political leadership. One important point, as a historical lesson, if you will, that I would like to stress, is that these 3 gentlemen, Ehud Barak, Benjamin Netanyahu in historical order, Ehud Barak, and Ariel Sharon, came to become prime ministers through a system that is no longer in effect in Israel. Between 1996 and 2001, there were 3 what are called direct prime ministerial elections. Israel came up with this very interesting system for that brief period of time when Israeli voters would vote not only for representatives in the Knesset, but they would also choose directly a prime minister. And the first prime ministerial election, which was held in the immediate aftermath of Yitzhak Rabin's assassination, was won by Benjamin Netanyahu. 3 years later, in 1999, Ehud Barak won the prime minister election. And as you will see in the next slide, after having left office on the record of having been the shortest serving prime minister of the country, the early 2001 elections were held by Ariel Sharon. Today, there was only one woman, one female prime minister that Israel has had. And I do have to say that if you follow and read Israeli news, you do see a lot of speculation about one of the subjects of our last lecture, Ayelet Shaked, the outgoing Minister of Justice, being considered by a number of journalists and pundits as a candidate for future prime ministership. Of course, in her current party, that's very unlikely to happen. For that, she would have to join a larger formation, perhaps Likud, and that's a possibility that doesn't seem to exclude in some of the interviews that she is offering. Although she's very clear about the fact that she will not join Likud so long as Benjamin Netanyahu is in charge. So these are the prime ministers whom we have had in Israel. Of course, if the 35th government is going to be led by Benjamin Netanyahu as well, then we are going to see a very important trend of continuity. But if it's going to be Gantz or Lapid, then a very important new chapter of change is going to be opened in Israeli political history. On this slide, I thought to share with you and show you a very important comparison in terms of how stable, and to the extent that you read stability as a sign of success. And by success, I simply mean political success. The political success of being able to master the different voices that the different parties bring to the coalition. Some prime ministers obviously have managed to do that better than others. And it's very interesting to see that the first prime minister of the country, David Ben-Gurion, and the currently the most recent prime minister of the country, Benjamin Netanyahu, stand as bookends, if you will, of being prime ministers who have served the longest cumulative number of days in office. Now, there is another important point to note here is that Benjamin Netanyahu actually now overtook David Ben-Gurion in terms of another piece of, in terms of one statistic, which is that he has served in office for the longest single stretch as prime minister. David Ben-Gurion's 13 plus years in office were in two longish terms, but Benjamin Netanyahu's 13 plus years in office consisted of his first term from 1996 to 1999, and then during the Netanyahu decade since 2009 until the present. There are a couple of points I would like to tease out from this slide. The first one is that there is no immediate association, there is no relationship between left-wing prime ministers or right-wing prime ministers serving longer in office or not. Although it's true that the two shortest serving prime ministers, Ehud Barak and Moshe Sharet, happen to represent the Israeli Labour Party in the case of Barak, Mapai, a predecessor of the Labour Party in the case of Moshe Sharet. Another point that I would like to mention is that Netanyahu and Ben-Gurion have mastered the art of political leadership under vastly different conditions. David Ben-Gurion never governed without his political party having less than 40 seats in the Knesset. Now, 40 out of 120, that's 1/3, which meant that because Mapai, the party that he led in all those decades, that meant that in any majority coalition that his party formed, his party always had a majority. Contrast that with Netanyahu. In all the years that Netanyahu governed and was prime minister of the country, his party, Likud, which he never left, never had more than 30 seats. In other words, Netanyahu never formed a government where his political party had more than a quarter of all the seats in the Knesset. And there were instances when his political party wasn't even the largest one in the Knesset. It's only in the last election that Netanyahu's Likud was actually able to, by itself, control 1/4 of the seats, 30. And if you do the math, If you only have a quarter of the seats, if you are prime minister and you only have 30 seats that you can safely count on, because that's how many seats your party has, that means that in the coalition, which has to have a majority of 61 plus, you're in a minority, right? So that is just there to show you that the conditions under which Netanyahu has been able to bring together the sometimes very motley coalitions to lead Israel, quite a bit different from the dominant position of the Labour Party that David Ben-Gurion was able to take for granted. And let me add one more important difference. David Ben-Gurion defined his strategy of leadership in many ways, but one particular one that I want to stress is his steadfast refusal to ever share power with Herut, the predecessor of the Likud party, or the Communist Party, Maki. We'll never go so far right that we would have to bring in Menachem Begin's Herut party, and we'll never go so left so that we would have to bring in the communists. In between, we'll be flexible. That's not Netanyahu. Netanyahu formed coalition governments that included the Labour Party, that included, not such a long time ago, Yesh Atid, the political party of Yair Lapid, who is one of the current candidates also for prime minister. So not surprisingly, the fact that Likud, under Netanyahu's watch, has been quite a bit weaker in a structural sense than the Labour Party ever was under Ben-Gurion's leadership, also forced Netanyahu to have to be more flexible when it comes to when it came to forming governments, and also when it came to holding them together. And I leave you with one last point, and I think that comparing these two leaders in and of itself is worth a very important study. Both leaders avoided being in office at the time of major wars. If you look at 1967, 73, 82, those were not the wars that either of them. So I leave it in the background. I heard in preliminary discussions that many of you are interested in talking a little bit about the situation as it's escalating today, and I think that this would be helpful background sort of context to situate that conversation against. Now, what is going to happen after April 9th? After April 9th, the process is pretty much going to be controlled up to a point by an officer of the Israeli government whom we usually don't hear an awful lot about, and that is the president. The current president of Israel is Reuven Rivlin from Likud, and I understand that President Rivlin will be coming to Toronto very soon for a very important cultural event. But this is one of the rare moments when the president actually enters central stage in Israeli political life. Why? This is why. According to the basic law on the government, you need to refer to Articles 8 to 11, the president has a week after the publication of the official election results to sit down with the representative delegations from the different political parties that cross the threshold, that enter the Knesset, and talk to them about whom they would like to see as prime minister. That's the conversation that President Rivlin is going to have with the delegations from each of those political parties. Now, political parties are not under any restriction to give an answer to that. And some of them are likely to abstain. Some of them are likely not to reveal whom they would like to support. At the end of the process, before a government is officially formed, the Knesset will have to pass a vote on the new government. And some political parties may just want to keep their cards very close, hold the cards very close to their chest, and wait until that last moment and decide whom to support on that crucial vote. So President Rivlin is going to have 7 days to talk to the different parties. And then he's going to have to decide, based on the input that he gets from these parties, which member of Knesset, in other words, has to be a member of Knesset, he's going to ask to try and form the new government. This person is going to have 28 days. Let me offer a footnote. If you read Israeli political news back in the fall, a very interesting piece of information went viral. At least in Israel, it certainly went viral. Benjamin Netanyahu claimed that President Rivlin was planning a constitutional coup against him. And the alleged constitutional coup seemed to consist of Rivlin playing with the idea, in case of a Likud plurality, not to ask Netanyahu, but some other member of Likud. It doesn't have to be the leader of the party. It just has to be a member of the Knesset to lead the party in the government formation process. And the candidate, or the obvious candidate at the time for that, was Gideon Sar, whom we talked about earlier, one of the high-ranking members on the Likud candidate list currently. Now, the dust has settled. There doesn't seem to be any validity to this planned constitutional coup, but that showed that indeed the relationship between the president and the would-be prime minister and the prime ministerial candidates is very important, and these processes are not to be taken lightly. Now, if the candidate for prime minister cannot form a new government in 28 days, he or she can ask for an extension, which is at the discretion of the president. That extension typically is given, but it cannot be more than 14 days. So it can take just over a month for the first attempt at forming a government to conclude. And when we planned our calendar in terms of the last session for this series, I was looking at very closely what the basic law sets out, just to give it a good chance that there perhaps will be a new government by the time we meet that. But it's possible, and I'm going to show a couple of historical examples, but it's possible that the person who was given this first mandate to form a government cannot do so. In that case, the president can invite another member of the Knesset to try to form, this would be the second attempt at forming a government. That attempt can only take 28 days, no extension given. If that attempt also fails, please watch this. This is very important. Then it's up to the Knesset to decide if there is a majority supporting a member to form the government. Ladies and gentlemen, this means that even before the first process starts, if there is an individual who can get together 61 plus Knesset members to support him or her, the first two attempts are a mere formality. Because on that last round, even if it's a member of Knesset who is not leading the largest party, if this majority is built on that last round, the person can be guaranteed to form the next government. And in fact, we are going to see from recent polls that this is a very important part of the calculation on the part of Netanyahu's Likud. And finally, any government that's presented has to be voted into office. So the Knesset fundamentally has to pass a vote of investiture to give its blessing, if you will, on the formation of the new government. Now, there were two cases when the government formation actually failed, when the individual whom the president asked to form the next government couldn't do so. The first instance was Shimon Peres in 1990, after the famous stinking trip, Hatargil Hamasriach, some of you might remember, and here he's seen with President Herzog. Shimon Peres formed a national unity government, or Shimon Peres' Labour Party was in the national unity government with Yitzhak Shamir's Likud, and but then Peres decided to withdraw. Well, actually he was fired, and then the rest of the Labour Party withdrew from the coalition, as did Shas, and that brought down for the first time ever an incumbent government on a vote of no confidence. So, with Shamir out of office, the president now looked around and checked whether there was another Knesset member who was interested in trying to form the government, and that was Shimon Peres. And in a very embarrassing moment in the process, Peres wasn't able to do so. So he actually had to hand the mandate back to President Herzog, so the government formation attempt failed. And Yitzhak Shamir was able to come back and form a new government, this time without Shimon Peres and the Labour Party. The second time when a mandate to form a government failed was much more recently, in the fall of 2008, after Ehud Olmert, Prime Minister on behalf of Kadima, which we saw earlier in the 17th Knesset, when due to his legal entanglements, he eventually resigned and passed the torch of Kadima's leadership over to Tzipi Livni, also formerly from Likud. Tzipi Livni tried to look around and see, and in fact she got the mandate from President Shimon Peres to try and form a new government, but she couldn't. and that paved the way to fresh elections to the 18th Knesset. It's interesting to note that in these two pictures, you have one person in common. Shimon Peres as candidate for prime minister and Shimon Peres as president. He's the only Israeli politician who actually served in both offices. So please remember, this is an important takeaway, that sometimes government formation attempts can fail and do fail, as we saw from these two instances. So the Netanyahu decade. This is going to be, and this is essentially the package of some of the major issues that the voters in 2 weeks from now are going to passing judgment on. Netanyahu has given remarkable degree of stability to the country. These are 3 different coalition governments now that he has held together in a row. The 32nd government that he formed between 2009 and 2013 included the Labour Party, it included a variety of conservative parties, but didn't include and religious parties. The 33rd government, he also invited Tzipi Livni's Hatnua, he also invited Yair Lapid's Yesh Atid, and then in the 34th government, which is the outgoing government, it was a much more compact, much tighter conservative religious coalition. So a remarkable degree of flexibility and stability. Now, what this stability conceals is quite a bit of a very high degree of centralization of power in the hands of the office of the Prime Minister. Prime Minister Netanyahu has controlled other ministerial portfolios. For example, he is also foreign minister. Well, he was foreign minister until just about a month ago, and he handed it over to, in a temporary fashion, to one of the senior Likud politicians. And he has controlled other ministerial portfolios much more so than other prime ministers did. And in a recent article, a colleague of mine also pointed out that he rotated his ministers in government quite a bit more so than other prime ministers did. And that may very well be the price for prime ministerial continuity, but there we have it. So 3 governments and and now a 10-year period of uninterrupted leadership. So stability is one important element of the Netanyahu decade. The second, Netanyahu's various governments have navigated Israel through a very difficult period in Middle Eastern political history. This is the decade when the Arab Spring happened. Right? This is the decade when the Syrian civil war erupted and Syria was seemingly falling apart. This is also the decade when Egypt went through a regime change and then a reversal of that regime change. Mubarak falling, Morsi coming in, or the Muslim Brotherhood coming in, and then Morsi coming, putting an end to the Muslim Brotherhood's rule. This is also the period. This is also the decade when relations with Turkey, one of the steadfast, long-standing allies of the state of Israel in the region, soured and have not recovered until today. Of course, it didn't have much to do. It wasn't only caused by the foreign policy and the regional policies by Netanyahu and his governments. Certainly, President Erdogan's policies towards Israel are much to be attributed for that as well. And Iran, the ups and downs associated, the trials and tribulations of Israeli foreign policy associated with the nuclearization of Iran is yet another extremely important development that characterized Middle Eastern politics during this period. And by and large, Netanyahu has been navigating the country, sometimes seemingly like ordering the country in a very difficult situation, but the country has avoided major military escalation so far. That adds another dimension, if you will, to the domestic stability that the first bullet point already summarized. 3, relations with the United States went through a very interesting seesaw, if you will. Relations with the United States under former President Obama's administration were very difficult. There is no denying of the fact, and relations between the two countries on the official level during the presidency of Mr. Trump are much improved. Many of you must have heard the news today that the Trump presidency, after having moved the American embassy to Jerusalem, added yet another, or put yet another feather, if you will, in Netanyahu's cap, by giving American recognition to the Golan Heights, which is something that is certainly there to show that this is a very different kind of bilateral relationship than we had seen before. That may not necessarily be good news for the future of Israeli foreign policy, because there will be at some point an end. There will have to be an end to the Trump presidency. And so Israeli politicians constantly think, how are we going to get out of this? How are we going to handle our American relations after Trump? Now it's good. Now we are getting many of the things that we want. We still don't see the deal of the century in its full complexity. But even so, there will be America after Trump, and we'll have to engage that. Another problem associated with this very drastic move from a very difficult to a very positive relationship with the United States has to do with the disappearance of Israel as a bipartisan issue, if you will, in America. Today, if you look at some of the comments that come from various, and the criticisms that come from various corners of the Democratic Party, are much, much more critical than we would remember them for many, many years going back. So there is a sense, there's a worrying sense that perhaps Israel may lose the historical bipartisan support that for such a long time it could take for granted in the United States. Now, this is an exaggerated statement. There were ups and downs to that bipartisanship, but it's important to note that. Diaspora relations. Relations with the American Jewish diaspora have been very difficult. And they have been largely, but not exclusively, made difficult because of the concessions that under Prime Minister Netanyahu, the government has made to the Orthodox parties, which has made it very difficult for non-Orthodox American Jews, and not just American, but of course American Jewry is the other big half of the global Jewish population, very difficult to associate with Israel as a place of future citizenship, as a place where their Judaism can be easily and without any restrictions exercised. Whether you think of the big question of who is a Jew, how Jewish status, Jewishness is determined, or whether you think of davening at the Kotel, where exactly at the Kotel, what to do at the Kotel, what not to do at the Kotel. These are all issues that come up and they seem to be very divisive rather than unifying when it comes to Israel and American Jewish relations. Now, the economy is a great news. And if you just look at one quick indicator from the World Bank, if you look at developments in GDP per capita, phenomenal growth during the Netanyahu decade. And this is PPP adjusted, so there has been, of course, changes to the value of the dollar. But if you, in the purchasing power parity sense, at the beginning of the Netanyahu decade, GDP per capita stood at almost 29,000 American dollars, and it's now at just over 33. So the Israeli economy is growing, Israeli economy is doing well, and that is something that the Netanyahu's decade, if you will, claims certainly can claim credit for. And finally, I mentioned already, but just want to mention one more time that some of the concessions that under Prime Minister Netanyahu, his governments have made to the ultra-Orthodox parties, also meant that there really hasn't been much change to some of the questions regarding the relationship between religion and the state, which is something that the New Right Party that we discussed last time is willing to take a more constructive look at, if you will. So in many ways, the 1947 status quo agreement that laid down the relationship between organized religion, Judaism, and the state really continues to be still in effect. Okay, so in the remaining few minutes, let me then work up towards the crystal ball. So this was kind of a historical background in terms of better situate what's unfolding before our eyes. Of course, I mentioned already at the beginning of the talk that the first important recent development since our last lecture has been the formation of the Blue and White Party. The Blue and White Party brings together, of course, Benny Gantz. This is not my caricature, but I thought it was very cute. Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid. But in its ranks, at the top of the leadership of the party, you have two other senior generals. former Minister of Defense in Netanyahu's last government at the early stages, Moshe Ya'alon, and also Gabi Ashkenazi, another Ramatkal, former Chief of Staff of the Israeli Defense Forces. Now, this image is there to show us that blue and white really brings together, on the one hand, political novices. Gabi Ashkenazi and Benny Gantz are political newcomers. They were not in party politics, electoral politics before. How they will do how they will come down and come through on particular issues, we have no history to go by in order to assess. Yair Lapid and Ya'alon, they come from very different political backgrounds and histories. Ya'alon is a former Likudnik. Yair Lapid is from Yesh Atid, from the centrist Yesh Atid. So blue and white is really not it's not a party, it's an aggregation of very different units and very different political streams and orientations. Another recent development that took place was the creation of the Union of Right or Rightist Political Parties, which was overseen and encouraged by Prime Minister Netanyahu. On the picture, of course, you see Bezalel Smotrich, leader of the National Union, and Rafi Peretz, leader of the Jewish Home. These two parties together are running as the Jewish Home Habayit HaYehudi political party. And in a last-minute deal that was brokered just before the candidate list had to be made final, Prime Minister Netanyahu encouraged these two leaders to make room on their list for another party, Otzma Yehudit, which is a political party that was earlier known Otzma Yisrael, formed by Michael Ben Ari. And on this picture, you see another leader of this party, Itamar Ben Gvir. This is a political party that descended from and owes its origin intellectually and ideologically to the Kahanist movement and Rabbi Kahana's Kach political party, which is the only party ever that was outright banned from participating in Israeli political life. Now, the formation of this alliance gave and earned a lot of indignation, not only for the Israeli right, but for Netanyahu in particular, because as Yossi Klein Halevi, that some of you may have read his commentary, this was tantamount to nothing worse than the desecration of Israel and of the idea of Israel. To actually bring back and make room for a political party that was associated with violence, with Jewish violence. This is not the Jewish way. This shouldn't be the Jewish Israeli way of doing politics. So that also dominated the highlights. In the last few weeks, one important development that affected the formation of this particular political party had to do with the disqualification of one of its members. So Michael Ben Ari, the leader of the Kahanist, formerly Kahanist party, is actually barred from running, so he had to be removed from this joint list of right-wing candidates. Another important development that shapes the contenders in the electoral campaign has to do with the publication of the much-awaited statement by the Attorney General, Mr. Mandelblit, who decided to recommend that Prime Minister Netanyahu be indicted for some of the charges contained in file 1,000, 2,000, and 4,000, and 3,000 and 4,000. That also dominated the headlines now for quite some time to come. While some newspapers have claimed that this is it, Prime Minister Netanyahu is now indicted, please remember it ain't so. The Attorney General simply recommended that he should be indicted. And with that recommendation, the indictment is pretty much off the table, if you will, for the purposes of the electoral campaign. Now we will see a period of pre-indictment hearings when the lawyers of the state and lawyers of the Netanyahu household are going to be making cases, adjustments in terms of how to structure the legal process. So the jury is still out, literally speaking, if you will, what's next. Now, the race as it is today is really between two large blocs. So in the first lecture, I told you about 5 main political families. Those 5 main political families have really consolidated between 2 large blocs. And this is the first bloc, the bloc of the conservative forces or the right, led by Likud. And this is sort of the Likud election list. The Likud election list is interesting in many ways. One important novelty I would like to point out is that in position 28, as part of the deal with Otzma Yehudit and the formation of the right-wing union I mentioned earlier, Netanyahu agreed to give a room to one of the members of the Jewish Home Party on the Likud list, so that the incorporation of Otzma in that joint list wouldn't take away too many spaces from the original partners. Now, some commentators suggested that this is illegal, but the Central Election Commission gave it its blessing. So this is the new Likud list. And then we have all the parties that we saw earlier. We have United Torah, Judaism, and Shas, so the two ultra-Orthodox political parties, Sephardic and Ashkenazi. We have the union of the right parties, and this picture still shows Mr. Ben-Ari and Itamar Ben-Gvir. These are the sort of the Otzma politicians. The new right party led by Naftali Bennett, Yisrael Beiteinu led by Avigdor Lieberman, Kulanu led by Moshe Kahalon, outgoing Minister of Finance. And there was a question in the first lecture, in the second lecture, when one of our friends asked me, Chabo, why don't you talk about Zehut and Moshe Feiglin? And my answer was, nobody gives him any seats. But that has changed. That has changed. Poll after poll shows that Zehut may very well be in the next Knesset. Moshe Feiglin, of course, also closely associated with the settlement movement, a former member of Likud, very much on the radical wing, formerly on the radical wing of the Likud, who brought into his party for the number 2 position Rabbi Chaim Amsalem, former breakaway from Shas. So if you look at this, it's really at one large, happy political family. Feiglin was from Likud. Kahalon, the leader of Kulanu, was from Likud. This is the Union of the Rightist Parties, which was formerly led by Naftali Bennett, formerly Likud, who is currently also leading Hayamin Hadash. Yisrael Beiteinu, led by Avigdor Lieberman, also formerly from Likud. And there is not much change really in the composition and the leadership of the two ultra-Orthodox parties. So not much change really. It's one extended political bloc, political family. What's striking is its fragmentation. And that is something that gives conservative political strategists quite some worry. Are the votes going to be effectively distributed amongst some of these parties? Are voters really going to be sure, voters who are supporting Zehut, that they are going to put Zehut over the threshold? What if they are what if Zehut picks up 100,000 votes, which is a lot of votes, but what if it falls short of the threshold? All those votes will be wasted. Those votes wouldn't have been wasted if they had been cast for Likud or one of the other true and tried political parties. So while in terms of composition, this right-wing, right-religious coalition is fairly compact ideologically and united, more or less united, it's very fragmented. On the left, you see lesser fragmentation. You see blue and white, you see the Labour Party and Meretz, and you see the Arab parties. And again, there is not much change again in terms of their orientation and their composition, other than the novelty of the blue and white coalition that we spoke earlier. So these are the two blocks. We've seen many, many political parties, but they are by and large coalescing into two blocks, except for one. Nobody really knows exactly where Orly Levy's Gesher, which until recently didn't seem to be crossing the threshold, but as of the last several polls, depending on the day, maybe in the next Knesset. And according to some polls, the predictions, her party may actually be in a position to make the difference between one coalition or another. Now, Orly Levy came in the last Knesset from Yisrael Beiteinu, which ended up being in coalition with Likud. But Orly Levy was also in consultations with the Blue and White, trying to form a joint alliance with them. So this is really a party that can go either way. We'll have to see. And of course,
is she the one who owns the soccer team?
No, she's not the one who owns the soccer team. The ones who owns the soccer team is Alona Bat, who is right here. He's on the New Right Party. She owns the soccer team. Orly Levy has the distinction amongst money and many other things of having been a former fashion model, so very popular in Israel, and daughter to David Levy, former Minister of Foreign Affairs and recipient of the Prize Israel. Okay, So the last few slides are about numbers and predictions. And I'm not going to want to bore you, and I do want to thank you for your patience, because I know that the 30 minutes I promised is way past. So let me start with the party-wise predictions. But remember, in Israel, we talk about parties, and we also talk about blocks. Now, here are the party-wise predictions. And I'm going to show you some numbers from 3 separate polls. March 20th, a poll taken by Channel 13 and Channel 12 on March 20th, and then by Channel 12 on March 24th. Not much change in terms of blue and white, except blue and white clearly seems to be as one of the leading parties. There is some change, but the seats are consistently putting this alliance of political parties near 30. When it comes to Likud, the polls are quite consistently showing Likud at this late stage in the race behind blue and white, but there is not much change in terms of that edge. There is some variation, but not a whole lot. Now, when we look at the next series of parties, and I'm just going to click through them very quickly, because here there is really nothing to note other than the fact that all of them, Labor, United Torah Judaism, Tal Hadash, one of the Arab parties, Shas, the Union of the Right parties, Meretz, and the New Right, they all are consistently expected to be in the next Knesset. Poll after poll, up until this late stage in the game, there is an expectation that these parties will be in the Knesset. Kulanu, not so sure. So the party of the outgoing Minister of Finance, according to the very last poll, may not be. Please remember that the statistical margin of error in these studies, in terms of percentages, is about the same as the you need for the threshold. So that whether a party is missed or not by these studies is very important in terms of coalition formation. Yisrael Beiteinu, it wasn't clear that Yisrael Beiteinu would be the next Knesset. Now it's a little bit more likely. The other party, Balad, is consistently in. Zehud, according to these last polls, is in the Knesset. And finally, Gesher, or the Levi's party, according to the last poll, is expected to be in the Knesset. I do want to remind us of a very important, funny, but clever sentence that the late Shimon Peres said. Polls in Israel are like fragrance, perfume. It's good to smell, but bad to taste. So smell it, but don't taste it. Don't build your strategy just on that, because you may end up losing out. Now, these are the party-wise predictions. Let's look at the block-wise predictions between left and right. Again, at this stage, so on March 12th, the combined total number of seats in the right clearly ahead of the left. And it didn't change much about a week later. The same day, by a different polling company, again, the margin was a little bit smaller, but still the right was ahead. According to the last one, however, and this is the very last one that I saw posted officially and also on the Knesset website, March 24th, so that was yesterday, Channel 12 produced the poll, according to which the combined total for the left-wing parties may actually have a majority. Now, there is another interesting question that polls ask. And that question is, who do you think will be the next prime minister? Not whom you would like to be, but who do you think will be? Right? Consistently, Netanyahu comes out ahead of Gantz and Lapid. And there has been no change in that. The margin changes, although not that much, but poll after poll on this question, the respondents are giving Netanyahu the benefit. So go figure, how do you put it all together? If with Shimon Peres's proviso, if Israelis really want Netanyahu to think that Netanyahu will be the government, then some of these previous bloc and party-wise predictions cannot be true. But so it's complex. That's all that it needs to tell us. Now let's look into the crystal ball. Based on all of this, there are three types of coalitions that I think we can expect to have. One of them, and I think that blue and white is going to win a plurality, regardless of the escalation in the security situation that we see today. Based on the history of polls, if a party was predicted so consistently to be in the lead, it's probably going to be in the lead. I think there is a very good chance that blue and white will win a plurality. Now, for blue and white to form a majority coalition, it would either have to do that with Labour and Meretz, plus the external support of the area parties. According to the last poll, it's possible. It's extremely unlikely that the area parties would ever enter an Israeli government. They've never done so. They supported governments, left-wing governments from the outside before, and that might happen. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is that blue and white may want to form a Jewish majority coalition, which would have to include, for ideological reasons, Labour and Meretz that are in its camp, in its bloc. And it's not entirely possible that they would make a deal with the religious parties. Please remember, the Orthodox parties governed with left and right-wing coalitions very happily in previous eras and stages of Israeli political history. Another type of coalition that could form is blue and white has the plurality, but Likud, remember what we said about how the government formation process actually unfolds, but Likud outflanks blue and white and forms a majority coalition with its former and current allies. If you look at some of the bloc-wise predictions, the right-wing bloc may very well be predisposed to have a majority, in which case it doesn't matter if Likud has the highest number of seats or not. The right may have a majority and may be able to form a government, much the way it happened after the 2009 elections, when Tzipri Kadima had the most seats, yet Netanyahu was able to outflank her. Or it's also possible that Likud is going to form a majority coalition that is not going to include some of the radical right-wing constituents like Feigelin's Zehut, but bring in Labour, as he did after the 2009 elections. The Labour Party is not really running the same kind of anti-Netanyahu campaign as Blue and White is doing. The Labour Party is, not that it's quiet, but the Labour Party is much more worried about attacking the new right. In a recent exchange of video clips, I don't know how many of you saw this, went viral, the black and white video clip produced by Ayelet Shaked, where she portrayed her new perfume called Fascism. And she paraded this new perfume sort of to clear up, if you will, clean the air of Israeli democracy. But in response to that, Stav Shafir, more or less the same age, also a young female politician from the Labour Party, came out with a response where she holds up the perfume glass of fascism and drops it to the floor. So right there you see, Labour is much more worried about a compact right-wing coalition. And the new right is much more worried about the possibility of Netanyahu maybe leaning and opening up the door for Labour. Netanyahu did that before. That's why I stress the importance of the flexibility of his leadership. I think this is something we may need to keep in mind as a possible outcome. And it's also possible, and I remember some early conversations with some of you in different capacities before, about National Unity Coalition in Israel. It's possible that the Blue and White and Likud may at the end of the day come together in some kind of a national unity framework. And including some of the other parties to keep a balance between left and right. I hope that's not going to happen because the past record of Israeli national unity coalitions hasn't been all that great, as you saw from my reference to the stinking trick before. So 3 types of coalitions: blue and white with Arab parties, or with possibly religious parties, but definitely including Labour and Meretz. So a left-heavy coalition, or a Likud-led conservative majority with the possibility of bringing in Labour, as it happened in 2009, or a national unity coalition. 3 possibilities. Now, of course, it's impossible to predict what's going to happen until and unless we know who it will be in the Knesset. So let me just show you, these are the closing slides. Thank you for staying awake. I know it's very, very late, and but let me just show you this first possibility. So based on the March 20th, yesterday's poll from Channel 12, that poll predicts these political parties, which I arranged them more or less from left to right, but I put the religious parties separately because, as I said, they could be potentially available both to go with the right or to go with the left. And Orly Levi's Gesher, which this poll expects to be in the Knesset, is hovering there as potentially available either to support this or that coalition. But if this is the new Knesset, then this is one possible narrow majority. So Gesher, in this particular case, could actually facilitate the formation of a very narrow 61 MK majority coalition. But Gesher could also go the other way and support the right-wing government. So this is one prediction. Channel 13, on the same day, doesn't expect Gesher to be in the coalition, but expects Kulano, right? Which the previous poll didn't expect to be there. But in this particular, according to this poll, the right-wing majority can safely and securely continue the business of governing at the helm of Israeli political leadership. So, who will form the next government? The easy answer to say, of course, we don't know. But what we can know are a range of reasonably realistic expectations in terms of the kinds of coalitional structures that we may see happening. Now, based on previous histories and based on previous interactions amongst the political parties, I think that the likelihood, based on these numbers, and based on the tendencies in the numbers that we've been together reviewing for the last 2 months, or almost 2 months, I think that the chances for the status quo coalition to continue, with Gesher or not, but a Likud-led conservative majority, including most of the right-wing parties, is more likely than not. Whether Zehut will be in it or not depends on whether Zehut will make it, but there are just too many assumptions that we would have to make about the likely participation or the likely role of the Arab political parties in a coalition led by Blue and White, and some of the other accommodations that Blue and White would have to make towards the religious parties, and possibly Gesher. There are too many assumptions that we would have to make for that, I think, to become reality. So if I were a betting man, which I'm not, but if I were a betting man, I would bet that, and also listening to the Israeli voter, if they think that Netanyahu will be the next prime minister, I think, and that really hasn't changed, while many of the other numbers have, I think that's a clue for me to take away. And so that's where I would put my dollar, my shekel, or whatever currency I might have. So, in closing, let me thank you very much for joining us tonight. Did we get it right? Well, that's not fair, because I'm trying to make the prediction. Did I get it right? I don't know. So I'm not actually making I'm not going to make a bet. But I go on record, and I went on record in answering Jack's question last time, and I was wrong. So I'm not ashamed to be wrong again. But that's what I think. That's my reading of the landscape, and that's my reading of the development of the numbers. So let's find out together how wrong I was or how correct I was. So please join us for the post-election assessment on May 27th. We will have a government by then, hopefully. If not, we will have a fantastic laboratory to actually explore the intricacies of coalition crisis. So we'll be meeting in the same place at the same time. And before we say goodbye, please join us for one of the upcoming events at the Azrieli Institute. I hope, Rabbi Vita, you don't mind me putting it on there. So on May 21st, we'll bring an author from Jerusalem who will be talking about Kafka's last trial, the cultural diplomatic battle between Germany and Israel and the two women caught in between. And on May 28th, we bring together with Federation Yossi Klein Halevi at 7 o'clock. Books will be available for purchase. He will sign the books, and then he will talk about his new book, My Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. But as we discussed with Yossi, he will also want to explore his Hungarian Jewish roots and what he calls the wisdom of Jewish survival, which I understand is a topic that is particularly dear to him. Hard copies of these flyers are available, and so I'm going to end my presentation and turn the floor over to Rabbi Wittmann and the Q&A.
Thank you so much. One of the things that I find listening to Chava is that not only is it clear and instructive and illuminating, but I find that after listening to you, I'm able to watch the news and read the news in a much more informed way. So I appreciate not only what you're giving us tonight, but the tools that you're giving us to be able to understand what is happening. We look forward to the unfolding. These programs that you're putting on are extremely important, and we look forward to those, as well as future ADATH programs. Again, we are planning to do something in terms of watching the election returns. Details will be forthcoming shortly. Do we have time for a couple of questions? It is a little bit on the later side, but let me take a couple of questions. And if you raise your hand, I will bring the microphone to you. Yes, hold on one second.
Okay. Hi. I have a question about what I thought I heard you say about Mandelblatt's recommendation. I'm kind of partisan, so I've been reading articles for a long time. From what I've surmised, from what I've read, is that he has an awful lot of power, and that it seems, at least that's what the new writer and Caroline Glick and others have been saying for a long time. So is it really not of consequence to the election and that he's made that recommendation?
Thank you, Lizzie, for the question. So the question is whether the Attorney General's recommendation for indictment can be written off as lightly, as I perhaps was suggesting. Well, when you look at the response and the post-announcement polls, if you look at them, they were really not that consequential. They were really not that consequential. They are certainly consequential in terms of what is going to happen to him. But that we will only see once the actual indictment process begins. And you're absolutely right. This shows a very important, in a very powerful way, the important powers associated with the law enforcement branches of the government, the judiciary, which is, of course, in and of itself, an area of contestation, and is one of the topics that we looked at briefly in the first lecture as one of the themes that the new right in particular, and you mentioned Caroline Glick, but not only her, Ayelet Shaked in particular, are promising to chip away at if they continue to be in government. So of course it will be very consequential. The Attorney General is a very powerful office, but in terms of the impact that the recommendation seems to have on the electoral mood and the electoral campaign, doesn't seem to have the kind of effect that we would have thought. But perhaps a very different kind of announcement would have had a very different kind of effect.
Thanks again for a wonderful lecture. Quick question. There's so many parties compared to what we have in Canada. So in terms of the blocks, and maybe you discussed it in a past lecture, but what are the issues of the average day-to-day voter, and why would, other than the personality of whether you like the prime minister or not, what are the bread and butter issues that the average voter is looking for? I mean, I was doing some reading in the Times of Israel. So for example, the cost of living, the cost of housing, taxes, social issues and stuff like that. So where does that play, frankly, because I don't see the difference between the Likud and the blue and white in any of those issues, and not to mention all these other small parties. I mean, there's a lot of big talk, but how does any one of these actually help the average Israeli in getting ahead and try to build families and social structures and the poor and the inequality?
Thank you very much, Dora. And you started the question very correctly and accurately by saying that there are so many more parties than what we have in Canada and the United States. So in a party system like Canada's or the United States, those fewer larger parties do speak, or they do try to speak to the average median Canadian or American voter. Not all of these parties do. United Torah Judaism, Shas, they speak to a very clearly defined constituency, the ultra-Orthodox communities. And so the economic issues they represent are specifically targeted towards the economic needs of that constituency. Now, a political party like Moshe Kahalon, he is actually one that, because he was former outgoing Minister of Finance, he definitely wants to cater to the economic and social needs of the average Israeli in the monetary sense of the term. So So he is one who argues and wants to have greater economic liberalization, greater flexibility in the markets, including the labor market, and also help Israeli families to cope with the very difficult problems associated with housing shortages and so on and so forth. But it's really only in the larger parties like Likud and Blue and White where you see enough breadth, because they are large parties, to accommodate and to appeal to some of those general needs. Now, you're absolutely right. Large parties often cannot be distinguished so easily from each other when you look at substantive policy issues. And we see that in Israel too. And you're absolutely right. You try to see how different are the socioeconomic promises, policy promises that Likud makes vis-a-vis that of Blue and White. It's really not that clear. And that's precisely the point. That the Blue and White strategy, by and large, is centered on a valence issue. Let's get rid of Netanyahu. Let's have a new leadership in place. And this is why, let me connect back this to Nitzi's question, the recommendation of the indictment and the postponement of any legal process against Netanyahu kind of took away the central issue that gave life to Blue and White's electoral campaign and electoral strategy. And that, I think, may hurt them. That's how I see it. So, but their strategy is really built on the valence issue of seeking leadership change rather than substantive policy concerns. And then, just to wrap up the answer, because many of these parties are very community-oriented or sectarian, they do have very niche promises and profiles. The Arab parties have very specific packages of policies that they seek on behalf of the Arab constituencies and so forth. So it's really only in the two large parties where you would see some of those commonalities, if you
Okay, last question.
It's more of a comment. I don't need the microphone.
No, you do for the recording.
Okay. I have the great honor of calling Chaba my friend. I've known him for many years. And it's in the spirit of an editorial comment, if you don't mind, Rabbi, that I think we're very lucky to have someone like Chaba in this community. And I encourage all of you to look at his website, the Azrieli Institute for Israel Studies, and what it does and what it brings to this community. I, of course, work for another institution which competes with Concordia, but that's okay. I can still be friends with Chaba, and I can still say we should all, to the best of our abilities, support what he does. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me echo that, and thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. Thank you all for coming. We look forward to the next one and to the unfolding of the process. Thank you very much. Have a great evening. Have a great day.